Some of the hardest problems in the world exist far above the planet. Our job? To launch the smartest solutions, to protect our satellites, clean up our clutter, to propel breakthroughs in propulsion, to learn more about our place in the universe, to outpace emerging threats. Every day, the Aerospace Corporation uses the latest technologies to ensure our nation's safety and leadership in space.
Welcome to the Space Policy Show. We have a fantastic episode for you today. We're going to be talking about responsible use of PNT for national resilience with Lori Gordon, Tom Powell, and Jim Platt from Department of Homeland Security. Before we get started, I just want to remind you can find us at aerospace.org/policy, engage with us on Twitter using hashtag the Space Policy Show, or ask your questions in the Vimeo video box below. Discussing the recent executive order of the same topic, Lori Gordon, Tom Powell, and Jim Platt will be talking about PNT. For those of you who don't know what PNT is, it's precisioning, navigation, and timing. GPS is an example of a system that's used to accomplish PNT. I'd like to give a little introduction of Lori, who will then in turn introduce our other guests. Lori Gordon is a technology strategist in national and homeland security, cybersecurity, and infrastructure risk and resilience at the Aerospace Corporation. She's an advisor to ISO, ANSI, and NIST technical working groups, and is a visiting fellow at the National Security Institute. She's also served on curriculum advisory boards in the areas of cybersecurity and infrastructure security, law and government, and resilient design. So let's kick it over to Lori to introduce our other guests.
Thank you so much, and I look forward to an exciting conversation today about the future of position, navigation, and timing as we watch it expand capability, geography, and application with two leaders in the field. And starting with Jim Platt, since 2016, Jim has led DHS's efforts to mitigate against the loss of PNT capabilities provided by the Global Positioning System. He was a major contributor to the presidential executive order strengthening national resilience through responsible use of PNT services. His portfolio has also expanded to include other high-risk programs such as space weather and electromagnetic pulse defense. Prior to joining DHS, Jim served for 20 years at the Department of Defense as the Chief of Staff for the Director of Army Operations Readiness and Mobilizations and across Cyber and Protection Directorates. He achieved numerous awards during this time, including the Legion of Merit and Meritorious Service Medals. He has a master's degree in leadership from Georgetown, a management and computer science degree from California University of Pennsylvania, and soon an executive MBA. And then we have Tom Powell, who is a colleague of mine at the Aerospace Corporation. He is a principal director for GPS user systems, supporting the production core at Space and Missile Systems Center, where he manages a team supporting the military GPS user equipment program. He worked at NASA Johnson Space Center on space station conceptual designs and participated in U.S. delegations in International Telecommunications Union, ITU, spectrum management. He supported the GPS program for over 15 years in technical research as well as regulatory policy and international coordination. He also serves on the National Space-Based PNT Executive Committee Advisory Board. Tom holds a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in aeronautical and aerospace engineering from Purdue, University of Texas, and UCLA, respectively. So thank you both for being here today. So let's kick it off. So Jim, I wanted to start with you. There's been a continued shift and variability in the threat landscape over the past few years, and DHS is really looking to enhance capabilities and mature its services to both the government, public, and private sector stakeholders to counter these threats. So what are some of the recent changes that you at your agency, CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, have seen, and how have these enhanced or impacted your mission?
First, Laura, I want to say thanks for having me here today to discuss this. And this really isn't something that's new. We've been seeing a change, especially in the PNT landscape over the past few years. And this really started back in 2013 when DHS had conducted a national risk estimate and saw that more and more critical infrastructure sectors were becoming more and more dependent on the use of GPS. And we recognized that that trend couldn't continue. So over the past couple of years, as we've looked to systems who have adopted not only GPS, but foreign GNSS systems, and then with all the augmentation systems that are out there as well that do amazing things such as automated farming and automated cars, we recognize that we needed to take action to secure more resilient PNT, but just as importantly, to make sure we have more secure and resilient systems that use PNT. So this just isn't about making sure that GPS is more secure. Obviously, that's important, but it's really about making sure that the systems that rely on PNT can continue to operate should there be disruptions or manipulations of the PNT services.
Great. So pulling on that thread, so on a daily basis, Americans depend on PNT services for three principal purposes, right? So it's timing, which is that synchronization of devices and events, location, whether it's mapping or surveying, and then asset tracking, such as fleet management. And so we know DHS CISA has designated PNT one of the 55 national critical functions. So the definition is, the disruption or debilitation of a capability such as PNT would have a debilitating effect on national security, homeland security, public health issues and safety, or a combination of those. And so on this year, you all put forth a PNT executive order to try to mitigate some of the threat or to build in resiliency into government and private sector use of PNT. So you played a significant role in this, as we've discussed. And so tell us about some of the goals of the executive order. How did it come about? What risks is it trying to address? And what are the intended outcomes?
Okay. So the executive order, we think, is a really big step forward. Now, President Trump signed the order back in February, but that was a long time in coming. As I mentioned earlier, we've recognized the problem with growing dependence on GPS for many, many years. Even if you go back to 2004, when the original space-based PNT executive order was signed, there were concerns, NSP 39, there were concerns about whether or not we were becoming overly dependent. So within the past couple of years, if we've taking a look at how we can address this issue, we really started to dig into how users were acquiring their PNT, what steps they were taking to ensure that their systems were resilient. And we found out that in a lot of cases, GPS had become so ubiquitous and really such an easy utility to tie into that many people just assumed that it would always be there, and that if it was always going to be there, they should assume that it's always trustworthy. Sometimes people ask me if they can trust GPS, and my answer is absolutely. The Air Force does an incredible job of running the GPS systems. I don't think you can, there's very few instances where there's ever been anomalies in that system that have had an impact on users. But what I tell people is that you can't trust the signal that you're getting is actually coming from GPS. So once you start understanding that, that's where the term responsible use of PNT came in. As we talked to interagency partners, people were using it irresponsibly. They simply put it into their system, assumed everything would be right, and then took off and started to conduct their operations. We seen several incidents where GPS was integrated into a system. When GPS failed, that system behaved erratically, and there were no plans in place to ensure safety of life or to ensure continued operation of a critical function. So we recognize that's what the executive order is actually trying to get at, that we use a deliberate risk-based approach to using PNT. If we're going to have autonomous cars in the future, imagine if for a minute you were driving down the road and the car said, turn right. Well, right now, if your GPS says turn right and you're driving the car and there's a lake to the right, you shouldn't drive into the lake. Unfortunately, we actually have situations where people do that. But imagine if that was automated and there were no other sensors to tell you that there was no road to the right, that was actually a lake to the right. So when we have an integration of all these sensors, you understand that there's possibilities that the system may not be functioning normally, or that you may be getting a GPS signal that is corrupted. You can use the rest of the system to serve as validation signals for that. And that deliberate risk-based approach is what we're really striving for across all of critical infrastructure. That's
great. We hear a lot, the word resilient a lot, and now I like to hear the word responsible use. So that's sort of a new interpretation of that word. But some of the key pieces and parts of the executive order, one is to develop PNT profiles, sort of develop this overarching plan, to develop, contract language, update the federal radio navigation plan. So it seems like those are going to be, worked, I guess, in parallel and then, in series going forward. So there's a lot of work to be done there. So I want to turn it over to Tom. Tom, we're seeing, advances in technology crossing all sectors and verticals. we've talked about this a bit before with Jim had mentioned, vehicles, autonomous vehicles and things like this. Really, the use of PNT is exploding across all new types of infrastructure, specifically emergency management capabilities, precision agriculture, accurate tracking of ships, and so on and so forth. And so we really focus here at Aerospace on the space sector. So could you talk about that and just sort of expand on how do we use PNT with space? Space is an enabler of PNT, and just take it from there.
Okay. As far as space, I could break it down into sort of two categories. First of all, the GPS enterprise is the service provider of GPS, and that's now part of the United States Space Force, and their job is to maintain and modernize the satellites and the control segment and the user equipment that make GPS possible for the military. But there are also many users of PNT in the space community. So most satellite programs rely on precise timing and position information for their missions. Some for some, it's a critical reliance on GPS, as there are for other systems. And so the executive order will impact space in those two ways. One, it'll impact the service provider to make sure that the service is as resilient as possible, but also to individual users to make sure that they are using PNT responsibly, as Jim mentioned. There's another aspect to it that relates to PNT. That's the industrial base. So GPS is reliant on atomic clocks that are space qualified, and GPS has actually altered sort of the manufacturing base for precise timing. People do things with GPS for precise time that they perhaps used to use physical clocks for, and so I think the executive order could have impacts to the timing industrial base. There's also a lot of secure microelectronics that are involved in GPS, certainly for military GPS receivers, and that's something that we want to make sure that supply chain is kept free of threats because it goes into very important microelectronic applications. And the other thing is there are a lot of new, I guess what I call new space impacts potential for PNT. There are lots of talk of proliferated LEO, where we have large numbers of LEO satellites, or PNT or things. And so I think the executive order would apply to that. There's also a lot of new entrants into the space launch category, and most launch vehicles going forward are going to rely on PNT for all or most of their mission profile, to include things like flight termination if there's an anomaly, which obviously is something that's very critical, that you want to make sure you can mitigate any threats to that.
Great. So you brought up proliferated LEO, sort of an emerging area. From your perspective, or even Jim, in the executive order, there's this the Federal Radio Navigation Plan, and I know that needs to be updated at various points. But beyond the PNT executive order, how do you see the future PNT risk landscape unfolding when we're looking particularly at the Arctic, which is it's increasingly an area of activity, with global weather and things like this. What impacts do we see for the Arctic and Arctic needs, and is proliferated LEO an opportunity there to bring additional capability?
Sure, Laura, I'll be happy to take that one. The proliferated LEO is an interesting concept because, once again, there is a global utility or global capability potentially to deliver PNT. But we also want to make people understand that every time that you adopt the additional PNT source, you are potentially also introducing additional risk to the system. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things that we really want to talk about with responsible use of PNT and the development of the PNT profiles, that you use a risk-based approach. So if you're going to introduce another system into your, or another PNT system into your operations, what benefits does it bring? What risk does it bring? And have you conducted an effective risk rewards trade-off as you go forward? And in the Arctic, that provides a very unique situation because, as we know, due to the orbits of GPS, maybe it's not as effective up there. But then you have to ask yourself, how much precision do you actually need before you introduce another system? If you're in open water and 10 meters or 15 meters of navigation are fine, and you're getting that from GPS in the northern latitudes, maybe that's all you need, additional to the things that or other observables that you can see. So once again, it really goes back to understanding what are your requirements. Once you understand your requirements, what PNT systems can effectively deliver those requirements to you, and then what risk do they also bring? Because let's face it, once something is being used by the general public, it always attracts more attention, both in academia and the black side of the world, the people, the hackers, to figure out how they can disrupt that, both for good and bad purposes. And if you don't take those things into consideration, you will find yourself with unexpected consequences and adverse impacts to your operations.
Thanks, Jim. And Tom, I wanted to pull your thoughts on that too, about the precision aspects here. Did you want to pull on that thread a bit or talk a little bit about like sort of the differences and sort of different criteria or anything?
So one of the things I'm looking forward to seeing the PNT profiles is hopefully they'll be capturing the concepts that we talk about in GPS, which are accuracy, availability, and integrity. Accuracy is pretty self-explanatory. Availability, when you think of a public utility, is when you turn on a light switch that the service is there. There's also another aspect called continuity, which means it's kind of always there and there are no extended disruptions or loss of service. But another one that's very important is integrity, and that is, as Jim has referred to, can you trust the signals? And we have a term that we use, hazardously misleading information. You want to make sure that if your position, if you have a PNT system that says you are here, that you are really there, and that you can trust the signals to tell you that you're really there. And also, more importantly, if for some reason there's a problem with the system, they can notify you that there's a problem, because that's an important part of integrity. It's not the system has to be perfect all the time, but when there is a problem, that it knows and recognizes a problem and can identify users in a timely manner, and that's very important too.
So also, Tom, on this, one study recently found that a GPS outage lasting 30 days could cost the U.S. economy $1 billion each day. And so we're seeing that, this increasing reliance on GPS signals from smart cities, autonomous vehicles, next generation communications is so critical. So what is your next step? What are you working on related to some of those national defense in an unclassified environment here? But what are you looking at 2-5 years from now?
So my role here at SMC in the production core is we're working to develop the next generation of military GPS receivers it's called MGUE, Military GPS User Equipment. And this will be the first generation of receivers for U.S. and allied forces that can use the M code signal. It's a modernized military signal. And we're very close to getting the first generation out there. And so that's really the main focus of what's called the user products division here at SMC, is to get those receivers complete development and get them tested and fielded.
Excellent. And Jim, what's next at DHS CISA, aside from the PNT executive order?
So the PNT executive order has plenty in there to keep us busy over the next couple of years. But I think the most important thing for us to take a look at is over the next couple of years, there's going to be a proliferation of technologies that can provide position navigation and timing services. I mean, there are existing services that are out there right now. Almost on a weekly basis, we hear of other capabilities to exist. It's really amazing what American ingenuity is doing in this field. And so I think over the next couple of years, the most important things for us to focus on is working with the people who use PNT to make sure that whatever PNT systems they use really provide security and resilience to their overall mission. And if we can do that within DHS, I think we're going to be successful. And it's no little challenge. The numbers of signals of opportunity that are proliferating for position navigation and timing are going to be many. But as I keep mentioning, each one of those is going to bring its own challenges with it. And we want to help owners and operators understand what those challenges are going to be.
And that's also leveraging your interagency as well, your peer agencies to get involved with the executive order and all other activities too. So.
Absolutely. If I could just add on to that, we couldn't do this without our interagency partners. We've got great working relationships across many departments. And, one of the things that I'd like to mention also is we're working on something called the conformance framework. Mm-hmm. And the conformance framework is if you go to an operator right now and say PNT is critical to your system, you should buy a secure and resilient receiver. Their question is going to be, well, what does that mean? Because there's no standards out there, and you can only rely on what the manufacturer is telling you. So the DHS S&T department is working on a set of guidelines with the private sector and the interagency to have voluntary standards so that when you go out and buy a receiver, you know what the expected performance parameters are that you're going to get from that. So we really want to thank our interagency partners and our private sector partners for us working through the conformance framework, and we expect to see the first iteration of that later this year.
That's great. You're tackling it at all angles: policy, standards, frameworks. That's great. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you both. It was great. It was a great conversation, and we'll continue the conversation with other agencies and sectors to get their perspectives as well. So thank you both. Appreciated it.
You're welcome. Thanks, Larry. Appreciate it.
Thank you to Lori. Thank you to our other guests, Tom and Jim. We're really excited that we had you on the show today to talk about PNT. It's been a really interesting episode. Again, find us on aerospace.org/policy. Ask your questions using hashtag the Space Policy Show or comment in the video box below. We would love to work with you and engage and answer all the questions that you have. So until next time, thank you so much for tuning in to the Space Policy Show.